master's and PhD at Harvard University. He briefly taught at the School of Asian and African Studies at London, University of London, before joining the faculty of University of British Columbia. His main research interests are Korean historical linguistics, Korean dialectology, etc. And today he's going to speak on the topic of I thank Korea for her books, James Scarth Gale, Korean Literature in Hanmun, and Allo, Metropolitan Missionary Orientalism. In fact, he published a book with the same title. So he's going to speak on his book just published. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Ross Kim with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I should say that I'm very honored to be speaking at the RAS, where James Scarth Gale was the first corresponding secretary. And in fact, James Scarth Gale, who of course is a Canadian, and was one of the sort of ground zero Protestant missionaries here in Korea, it was actually Gale who gave the very first lecture at the Royal Asiatic Society on October 24, so this month, in 1900. And that lecture was part of a, so we say, a kind of staged debate that was set up by George Heber Jones, where he essentially said, Gale, you take position A, and then Homer Hilbert, you take position B. And they then proceeded to take diametrically opposed positions. So Gale's first paper here at the RAS was titled The Influence of China Upon Korea, where he essentially laid out a very almost caricature-like view of the ways in which, the multiple ways in which absolutely everything, according to him, in Korean culture was in one way or another derived from China. Which of course has helped give him a really bad reputation with 20th century Korean scholars, even though it was meant to be a kind of high school debate sort of situation. So in other words, I don't think we need to take his positions too seriously in that paper. But then of course he was responded to the following month by Homer Hilbert in his paper, Korean Survivals. So Gale had said everything starts with Hija, who came from China and brought culture from China. Homer Hilbert says, no, it goes back to Tangun, everything came from Tangun, and there's all these things here in Korea that are native and autochthonous and indigenous and have nothing to do with China. And of course, 20th century scholarship has been very kind to Homer Hilbert for that position. Now, of the Koreans that he met, it says, for the young foreigner that I was, the first impression that I received of Koreans was this 청량같이 순결한 것, that pure, like a virgin, like a maiden, sort of, you know, very. And this is where it gets a bit orientalizing, but it's coming from the heart. So he saw this purity. He says 신사같이 점잖은 것. These, I don't know, how should we? What's the word we're looking for? Gentlemanly, or sort of I don't know, well-reared, you know, not obnoxious, understated, all these things that 점잖다 is. 농부같이 til박한 것, sort of unaffected, like a peasant farmer, you know, plain and simple, straightforward, straight up. 군사같이 겸손한 것, and modest, like a Confucian scholar. 이 모든 조건, all of these conditions, they were precisely the sort of characteristics of my ideal human being. And this I think is very important, because these are also the kinds of things that people later said about Gale as a person. These were ideals that he himself, I think, tried to pursue and that he saw in Koreans when he first came to Korea. His next topic is ever-changing Chosun, where he reviews very quickly all the really tumultuous changes that Korea had gone through right before his eyes, especially the political changes. Then he says, has a section called Chosun's Civilization is in his spirit. And this theme runs throughout his works, through his entire career, that what Korea had was something great, but it was spiritual and it wasn't material. And that the Koreans were losing it rapidly and had just about completely lost it. Then the next section says, scoff, look down your noses at material things, at munwul. The next section, and this is, I'm going to come back to this obviously, he says, I have introduced Korean books, and he uses the word munhan, to the world. And then a section on Chosun's future, where he kind of dodges the question as to whether he thinks it's got a positive future, and says, well, the entire world is going to hell right now in a handbasket, and basically, if it really does go to hell, it won't be the Koreans' fault, kind of thing, and he dodges the question. And in his very last words, I believe, are do away with indolence and do away with the hanmun. So let me go back then to the section where he says, I have introduced Korean books to the world. Because this, I think, is the one thing he says in this essay where he says, this is the one thing I have done while I've been in Korea. So he says, I love and respect everything about Chosun. I love its natural beauty, the Kumsudansan, and I respect its unaffected and modest people. I treasure the sources of it all, Chosun's culture and Chosun's hunminjangun. If anybody asks me what I have accomplished in the course of 40 years in Chosun, I am embarrassed that I have nothing to boast of in reply. That would be the kunjae kyomsonhanga. But of one thing I am certain, and that is that I can swear in front of you all that I have never been lazy. In Chosun, I've exerted myself more in educational matters than in religious work, and one thing that I have accomplished is that I have conducted research on Chosun literature, imperfect though my efforts may be, and introduced it to the West. In addition to the Powen Changjit, which would be the collected works of Chung Mung-ju, the American Library of Congress preserves several thousands of literary works that I collected for it. So this is the one thing he singles out in this essay about what he did. It's about books, and it's about literature. And I think that's why there's been so little research done on Gale, really, because all of the church historians who have made the trek to the University of Toronto Rare Books Library to look at his papers, going there hoping to find good stuff, good dirt on the missionaries, or on evangelization, or the history of the church, they go there and all they find are reams and reams of manuscript translations from hanmun into English, and from hanmun literature. So for Gale, at the end of his career, books and the literature in them, as well as his schools, the Kyeongshin Hakgyo and the Cheongshin Yeoja Hakgyo, were the accomplishment that he boasted of. So I'm going to fast forward now 10 more years to 1937, which is when he died. And then there were some, there was a little bit of a ripple that went through the Korean press, remembering Gale. So how was he remembered in the Korean press? So the journal Chowan in 1937 published this piece called Fragments, Fragmentary Impressions of Dr. Gale. And there's just a paragraph each by a few people, and some of them you will recognize and some of them you won't. So Yoon Chi-ho needs no introduction, I presume, and his little thing said he remembers Gale as a man of great erudition. He says he was a man of great erudition, a man of literature. He was a great storyteller, a great speaker. He knew all about Chosun history and literature. He says, quote, among the Western missionaries who have come to Korea so far, there is probably nobody who can follow him in talent or erudition. And I have to include this bit also. He says, he also discusses the unauthorized translation of the Bible that Yoon Chi-ho himself bankrolled. Gale was despairing because no one would publish his new translation of the Bible because it was considered so radical and it was not approved by the church. So Yoon Chi-ho gave him the money to publish it. But then he says, this was such a great translation, he says, as a natural, flowing, true to Korean kind of uya, a sort of loose translation, a meaning translation, not a literal translation. And then he goes on to say, he says, it was a Chosun 말에 적당하도록. It was appropriate for Korean. And then he warns, he says, imagine if you took an expression like English, good morning, and then translated that as 좋은 아침이요. He says, 조선 말로는 싱겁지 않습니까? Isn't that really lousy Korean? And of course now people are saying that. So he's turning over in his grave now on that one. The next paragraph was Chung Tae-eung, who was a very prominent leader in the Bible Society here in Korea, and he describes him as a giant of Korean studies. And the word is Chosunhak. This Chosunhak was a major keyword in the 1930s when Korean intellectuals and sort of cultural nationalists sort of started delving into their own history and culture as a kind of response to what the Japanese were doing. But here they are looking back a generation earlier and saying he was the sort of the ground zero. He was the giant. And Chung Tae-eung, he graduated from the Baeje Hakdang and was part of that Christian crew. He also says that Gale was a literary man. He had conducted profound research into Chosunhak. He says, quote, he taught Koreans with Chosun studies and Chosun knowledge, end quote. And he tells this out. He gives this little episode where this Chung Tae-eung was trying to write a paper about the history of Gukjang, of kind of state burials. And he says, I looked everywhere, I couldn't find any materials, and I went to Gale's house, and Gale had this amazing system of index cards where he could look up things in all these different historical sources and pull them off his shelf, and I got exactly what I needed. He says he read books in hanmun well, and made up cards in which he could immediately search any word through tens of thousands of volumes of Chosun books. And this is true, I'll talk about this in a minute. The next person is Kim Won-gun, who says he was an orator and an antiquarian. An antiquarian is 고고학자, which of course nowadays means an archaeologist, but it really is somebody who delves into old stuff. And that's kind of what Gale did. So he was one of Gale's pundits, and I'll come back to this idea of pundit in a minute. But he worked with Gale. He says, I knew him for some 30 years. He says he was a great storyteller. And he says, anybody who was a busy person about town, whenever they saw Dr. Gale coming from far away, immediately took a detour around the nearest sort of side street because they didn't want to get cornered by him. Because once he started talking to him, it was so interesting that you couldn't escape, and then you were late for your next meeting. That's Kim Won-gun. Lee Won-mo was another of Gale's co-translators and pundits, and he describes, he focuses on personal qualities. He says he was a really generous human being, a truly magnanimous, patient man, and also a great storyteller. And I think the final one was Hugh Miller, who again focuses on the literature, says he was a really great literary man. Okay, so let's go back to this idea, these two people here that I described as his pundits. So one of them said, I spent 25 years with him. The other said, I knew him for almost 40 years. So in 1917, in the Korea magazine, which Gale more or less single-handedly wrote and published for about 3 years until 1919, he has this little essay on Korean literature where he says, quote, there are but few real Chinese scholars among the foreigners of the East. It is the understanding of the endless references to Chinese history and mythology that is impossible for a foreigner to become master of. He can, with the aid of a good pundit, get at the thought that underlies Korean literature. You require at your elbow a scholar of the old school. So let's talk about pundits. So he had this image of his co-translators and his hanakja as pundits. And of course, the pundit obviously is a Sanskrit word, and it comes from originally these British missionaries that were working in India, and William Carey is one of the very first. This is a famous image of him with one of his pundits that helped him do translations into and out of Sanskrit. And then the other, this is a bit hard to see, but the other really notorious case is Sir William Jones, who was also in India. And this is a famous, this is at his college in Oxford, and you can't really see, but this is Sir William Jones with his three of his pundits in front of them, and modern-day Indian intellectuals hate this because, oh, how rude, he has crossed his legs in front of them and he's elevated and they're below, and this shows the subjugation of India to England and so on. But there's this notion that the Western scholar, Oriental pundit, was a kind of exploitative relationship. Well, there's a lot of literature about this question of Orientalism and pundits. So R.F. Dierlich, this is one of the few articles about Orientalism in Chinese studies, because most China scholars sort of have this fantasy that it doesn't apply to them. But he says, quote, Orientalism was a product of the circulation of Euro-American and Asian intellectuals in contact zones or borderlands. And he asks this question, is Orientalism a thing or is it a relationship? And I'm really curious to know what the relationship was between Gale and these traditionally educated hanakja that he worked with. That's, I think, the key question. So another paper by Gale, this is more about India, says within a context of colonial domination, the personal relationships that both British Orientalists and their Indian counterparts engaged in were based on scholarly conviviality and even friendship. So pushing back against this narrative that this was a relationship that was inherently power-based and exploitative on the part of the imperial power. And Carnan, in another article, says any hasty denunciation of Sir William Jones' cultural arrogance, a la Said, Edward Said, in Orientalism or Telcher, rules out our investigating just how and why these two parties pursued their conversation. I think we need to pursue this. So, this is Gale towards the end of his career. There are very few photos of Gale, I should say. But this is a well-known one with 3 of his pundits that were working for him full-time, working with him and for him, under the aegis of the Christian Literature Society here in Seoul, from 1922 to 1927. This is Lee Chang-jik, Lee Gyo-sung, Lee Won-mo. Lee Chang-jik was his teacher from the very beginning and was 1 year younger than him. And so that's sort of a very nice photo of that group. Here's another photo of them at work in Gale's study in his house. And so there's Lee Gyo-sung here. This is Lee Chang-jik with his back to the camera, and Lee Won-mo. There you can see some of Gale's books. And this, I don't have a clock here. I guess I do. And how long am I supposed to go?
8:30.
Okay, thank you. I'm watching the clock. So let's talk a little bit about his pundits. So this is about Lee Chang-jik. So his papers in Toronto do have some diaries, not a lot, but some. And in them you can find evidence that he was very fond of, very close to, very attached to these men that he worked with, basically day in and day out. So one of them, Lee Chang-jik, has had 30 years experience, and yet he gets only 60 yen per month. So he's basically lobbying for more money to pay these guys. I hope to make it a little more myself. He's paying more out of his own pocket, as he really deserves more. His equal as to knowledge of how a book is written, its ease and simplicity of style, is not readily found. He is an excellent Chinese scholar as well, but I shall let him stand at 60 as already granted. For Lee Won-mo, I am asking 90. He is by far and away, in my experience of 30 years of literary work, the best equipped. And then he goes on to argue and says, by the way, Lee Won-mo's older brother is an interpreter at the American consulate and gets even more than that. So, you have to give him more money, kind of thing. Then, so this is back, still on Lee Chang-jik. This is one of the first photos we have. Shortly, I think maybe within 2 years of his arrival in Korea, and that's Lee Chang-jik and Gale. This is another one of Gale here and Lee Chang-jik up here, also 1891. Very bad photo. This is from, I think, the Moffat collection at Princeton Theological Seminary. That's Lee Chang-jik with Gale's 2 kids there. Here's Lee Chang-jik on the Bible translation committee for a few years, helping Gale, working with him. Let's see. Many accounts like this in his diaries of he and his buddies, he and his hanakja, he and his pundits, going on various cultural outings to visit the grave of Igubo, to go to Buddhist temples, to visit inscriptions. And so here he says, in 1914, we set out the AM with Messieurs Cho, Nam, Lee Chang-jik, and Lee Won-mo, Kim Do-hee. All of those were his hanmun pundits. He's what I call his A team, because he had a B team as well. And calling a gate man to visit Pongwon-sa. We then, after tiffin, does everybody know what tiffin is?
Tea time.
Tea time, it's lunch. It's a Scottish word, and this is great Canadian Scottish, diaspora Scottish. We went to see the tomb of King Cheongjong, who reigned from the, and he always throws in these details in his notes. But the point is he's hanging out with these people. Next, a lovely autumn day. Went to Bible school, had a chat with Dr. Hardin, it's probably Dr. Hardy, Yi Sun-seng was about, Yi Changjing was also about today. I must jerk him up a bit. Yi Changjing was always getting in trouble with the Japanese police, and he was also always sick. Below, it says, a cold breeze blew all day today, went out with Yi Changjing in the morning and bought the 7 sacred books of China, the Ha Sao Sam Young. We'll translate later. Imagine the hubris to say, I'm going to go out and buy the 7 classics of China, I'll translate them later. But he actually did translate all of this Ha Sao, which is amazing if you think about it, but not the other 3. And so you get a sense of where his priorities were. And then still on the topic of Yi He-gyung, this is Yi He-gyung's daughter right here, shortly after she was imprisoned by the Japanese for being part of the Egu Puinhui, this group of patriotic women. And sitting next to her is the daughter of the next man, this man, Kim Won-gun, who taught hanmun at the Chongqing Girls' School and also worked closely with Gale for many years. So he's another typical case. He graduated from Peije Hakdang. He taught hanmun for many years at Chongqing Yohakkyo. And then, this is just here because I'm desperately looking for any descendants of these people. They're very hard to find. But he also published his own books, very traditional hanmun kind of books. So he wrote this Myeongwon Shin Yoja Bogan, which is a kind of updated conduct manual for good Confucian women that published in 1922. This Pandit's Kim Do-hee, there is no photo, I can't find a photo. Already, Gale is writing about him in 1902. He says the boys' school, and here means the Kyongshin Hakgyo, which was later sucked into what became Yonsei University, is making a beginning, and the 4 lads now on hand are working diligently. It says, Messieurs Yi Changjing and Kim Do-hee, take Chinese. They were teaching hanmun at his school. And then one of his notebooks, the notebook in which he translated Menja from beginning to finish, he says, Mencius, at the very end of the 3rd notebook, he says, finished translation with Kim Do-hee, April 26, 1924. So we're going to be publishing this as part of our series. He also translated the Nono, the Analects of Confucius, the Tehak, and then what's left, the Chunyon. So, Kim Do-hee died in 1925. And so he says, I worked all afternoon on Mr. Kim's books for the Congressional Library. He brokered a deal to sell his books to the Library of Congress. Hope to finish them tomorrow and then have them shipped. Dear old Kim Do-hee, I think of him as I handle his books. So again, everything is revolving around books for him and the people that he read them with. Next is Yi Won-mo. Yi Won-mo was, I think I mentioned earlier, he translated the new edition, the unauthorized version of the Bible with Gale, and is listed as a co-translator. Gale always listed his co-translators. Many other missionaries did not. And then he was active in the Yeongdong Kyohei. He translated these books with Gale, Swiss Family Robinson, a book of strange stories, which is kind of like a Yadamjik, but translated from English into Korean, includes Rip Van Winkle, stuff like that. And then other books that are more Christian in nature. And then even after Gale left the field, he continued to translate. He was one of the most prolific translators in the 1920s and 30s. Finally, Lee Gyo-sung, one of his other pundits, was a big guy in mathematics. He taught math at the YMCA. He taught hanmun. And then Gale says here, he is the 9th generation removed from Lee Jong-gu, born in Shakespeare's year 1564. And whenever he wrote about Joseon history, he always drew a connection to what was happening in Western Europe. And so again, this is kind of a pushback against the Orientalism thing, because the idea of Orientalism is that you deny the Oriental history, and you deny them historical parity. But he always had this idea that we're all on the same sort of chronology. And Lee Gyo-sung also, on his own, published very hanmun kinds of things. A math textbook in 1901. These are very rare books. Then there's one at the Adan Mungo that he did later in 1922. So, coming back to 1920s, Gale wrote this wonderful essay in 1923. I don't think it was ever published, called The Value of Books. What wonderful things books are. They are like links in the chain of eternal life. They bring forgotten ages together and let us look into the hearts and minds of those whose bodies have long since molded into dust. And then at the bottom, I thank Korea for her books. So this is a period in time, starting with right just before the Japanese officially take over Korea as a colony. There was this race for Korea's old books. Everybody was trying to dig out the old books. And of course the Japanese were better funded and better organized than anybody. And so they started in 1909 this Chosen Kosho Kankokai, where they systematically dug out and published many of these classic works in hanmun. And Gale was on their subscription list. He got every single one of their books. At the same time, Trenan Sun, almost at the same time, forms the Kwangmunwei, who are doing exactly the same thing, and oftentimes publishing exactly the same books, but essentially trying to do different things with them, or to make different claims with them. And then in the 1920s, two more Japanese societies are doing the same thing, but they're actually translating these classic works from hanmun into Japanese. So while all this is happening, Gale is doing exactly the same thing, often with exactly the same titles, but doing it into English. Only his stuff is not getting well known. Hardly any of it ever gets published. So it's like this kind of parallel track that is, to this day, more or less unknown. So here he says in 1927, and again this is the year he retired, probably his last literary report for the Christian Literature Society, the name and fame of Korea will stand in her literature in what she has written. She has little else except her few porcelains and pictures that will leave her name marked on the world's tablet. Her books are receding more and more from sight behind the bars of the Royal Library, deep hidden in the private homes of Tokyo, or stored up in the Congressional Book Palace of Washington, the Library of Congress. This kind of concern for the book patrimony of Korea. Well, speaking of the Library of Congress, it turns out that some of his books are in the Library of Congress rather than in Toronto. This is one. It's hard to see. This is the cover. It says a catalog of Korean literature. And what it is essentially a write-up of almost 1,000 different titles from pre-modern Korea, where he writes, he says who the author was, when he lived, what the book's about, and a sort of brief appraisal of the book. And in the inside cover, he has this explanatory section, and he says, quote, "The books mentioned here grow more and more rare as the years go by. Only a matter of time, and it would seem that the very memory of them would be forgotten, and yet they are Korea's most notable monument of all her past history. The best collections today, those abroad, are to be found in Paris, not a surprise, London, not a surprise, Washington, not a surprise, and Hollywood, California." Huh? Right? Huh? Right? Mr. McCormick, ooh, who's that? Right? And those in Korea in the government library, the Chosen Christian College, which became Yonsei, and Bishop Trollope's collection. Tokyo probably has the largest number of all, as many Japanese scholars have private Korean libraries of their own. And so this particular catalog that he did, and it's very long, is probably based on this 1919 edition of the Chosen Kosho Kaidai published by the Chondoku. But he also had many of these books himself and had used them, so he actually knew what they were. Then, the Library of Congress has this amazing document. This document is titled Index of Korean Literature, prepared by James S. Gale for the Asiatic Institute, New York. Huh? What's that? No one knows, right? And then authors, he lists J.S. Gale, Cho Byung-mo, Nam Ju-won, and Kim Do-hee, who were three of his earlier A-team pundits. And then what it is, it's a list of 144 works in many, many volumes, and it is literally an index to all of them. The preface says, some of these editions are very old, about old Korean books in general. For example, the Igyubo's Munji printed around this time. The writer is now a chairman of a committee to purchase books for a recently established college in Seoul, which can only really refer to the Chosen Christian College. But as yet, no trace can be found of duplicates of these oldest sets. The Japanese, some of them at least, are keen purchasers of Korean literature. They have literally stripped the market. And so I feel very happy that the Institute has been able to secure as many representative works as it has. So he basically got the world's first ever research grant in Korean studies from this Asiatic Institute in New York that allowed him to go buy all these old Korean books, hire 3 scholars full-time for 4 years to index them all on cards, and then he wrote it up. Which, if you think about it, is a heroic feat. He was also taking money from the Library of Congress to buy books for the Library of Congress over a period of 10 years. This is what that description of this collection looks like. Up here, you can't see it, but up here it says Kichuk Yanheng no, number 107. It's a travelogue to China. And then you start this index. I'll give you a close-up of the next page. So this is what the index looks like. Random stuff, House of God's Government, Roman Catholicism, rabbits, Taro, oppression, just random stuff. But going both ways, this really long index, and then telling you all the books written in hanmun where you can find information about this topic. Well, so what is this collection? Well, it turns out that the special collections of Claremont colleges in Southern California have this random collection of old Korean books that somehow got separated from the index and the lists that Gale created. And it was Mr. McCormick, who was the secretary of the Asiatic Institute, that folded immediately after World War I. And so our colleagues and friends in Claremont College have these books and have no idea where they came from. And this random index is sitting in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Sort of a typical story of what happens to Korean stuff at this time. Frederick McCormick was a very respected journalist writing about East Asia in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And this is the actual book. If you go to Claremont College, here's the book, Kichuk Yaneng no, and then up there, a little tag says number 107. I mean, they're clearly the same books from that collection, and that's what this particular book looks like. Well, let's go back to Chosen Christian College. If you poke around on the Yonsei University website or in their publications, you find out that it was founded in 1915 with that name, and that the library began with a donation of books from Horace G. Underwood, the first principal. But Horace would not have been the kind of guy to collect hanmun books. And there's nothing anywhere on the Yonsei website or in its published materials by its scholars that would give you any inkling that Gale had anything to do with the rare books in their library. But if you go to the ledgers, his manuscript ledgers, Ledger 12 has this index of the books of the Chosen Christian College. And here is a scan of that. And it says here, number 42, Kimun Chonghwa, 4 books. From here I can't read what that says, records of something or other. And it's, a manuscript description of this particular manuscript book. Okay? In 1929, the Transactions of this Very Society published an article by Bishop Trollope called Korean Books and Their Authors, followed by an addendum, index of Korean books and their authors by the Right Reverend, and of a short list of some Korean books in the Chosen Christian College Library. And people have often mistakenly thought that this was Trollope that did that, but it wasn't. It's exactly what I just showed you. It's that, typed up 11 years later. And then here we go, number 42, Kimun Chonghwa, a bunch of old stories. Now it's got a new title. He's edited it in the meantime. 4 books, MSS. This is the most interesting collection of stories dealing with Korean thought and custom that the reviewer has ever seen. That's Gale talking. Okay? Well, if you go to the website for the Korean, the Yonsei University Koseoshil, the rare book, this is what that book is described as. It's really lame. And then they published later an actual bibliographic sort of description of it, no mention of Gale, even though the book itself is full of Gale's manuscript handwritten notes. So, this book was not translated into Korean until 1999 by Kim Dong-wook, the Kumgyeok Kimun Chonghwa. And on the right is Gale's translation of approximately 120 of the stories that Shine Park and I just published this year, I think, through the University of Toronto Press, as the first in a series that we're calling the library, the James Scarth Gale Library of Korean Literature, because he has so many unpublished translations. So it took almost 100 years for Gale's translation of this particular story collection to see the light of day in English. And there's much more to be found. So let me wrap up then. I think I'm making good time. Let's concluding remarks. So why is Gale largely forgotten today? Even in Korea, is one question that faces us. And then why was the bulk of his work never published? Well, for one, he left the field in 1927. This was a really bad idea. This is, from my selfish perspective, this was a bad idea, because as soon as he left Korea, he lost contact with his pundits, and without his pundits, he couldn't work. I mean, he could read hanmun reasonably well, but he had to have someone at his elbow walking him through it, and then giving him the sort of kugyak, the Korean translation on the fly, the way Koreans do it, and then writing it down. Without his pundits, he couldn't do it. And furthermore, not being in the field, unlike the Underwoods, who had lots and lots of progeny, who all stayed in Korea and got lots of attention and were very well organized, Gale just kind of, I think, slipped into oblivion because he wasn't here. Post-war Korean scholarship has misunderstood Gale as somehow, not just somehow, but somehow uniquely pro-Japanese. But he was no more pro-Japanese than any other missionary was at the time. All of the missionaries, whatever their denomination, had to come to a certain accommodation and understanding with the Japanese authorities just to work here. And I think he has been unfairly categorized as pro-Japanese. Finally, there's this kind of distinct post-war Korean discomfort with his dismissal of vernacular literature. In other words, he thought that anything written in Korean, anything in hanmun was garbage. Anything in hanmun was pulp fiction. Because modern Korean literature had literally not yet started, or it was just getting started. And it was a very, very weak presence in the 1920s when it sort of got off the ground. He thought that the new stuff that people like Kim Dong-in, Lee Kwang-soo, that they were writing, he thought it was rubbish. And he much preferred a kind of classical voice and a classicizing kind of approach to literature. So for him, the only true literature was in hanmun. And that wasn't his idea. He got that from the Koreans around him. So let's talk about Gale as a missionary Orientalist scholar. He immediately evokes these parallel figures in British India. We've talked about them, the Careys, William Jones, but also Hong Kong. I think of James Legge. James Legge, who translated all of the Chinese classics as a missionary in Hong Kong, and later professor at Oxford. And Gale despised Legge's translations of the Chinese classics. And he wanted to show that he could do a better job than Legge by translating into English through the eyes of a Korean, is kind of the way he put it. So I think what's interesting about Gale here is what I call his Allo metropolitan positionality. So usually when we talk about Orientalism, the idea is that the missionary or the scholar out in the colony has the political metropole behind him. So the full force of the British Empire was behind Sir William Jones. Or for the Japanese scholars in colonial Korea, they had the Chongdokbu, literally paying them to do their projects. Whereas Gale, what was his metropole? Well, he's sometimes referred to as Yonggugin, and he sometimes referred to himself as English, but also identified as a Canadian. But they weren't in charge in Korea. That wasn't the political metropole. And if anything, the higher power to whom he reported was God himself. So he didn't have that kind of power relationship, or certainly not the same kind of power relationship with his pundits that other scholars, other missionary Orientalists did. So I think that's one thing that helped consign him to oblivion. Oblivion at the time outside of Korea. He had great difficulties publishing his translations. No one was interested. He tried to publish a huge volume of collections of poetry by Lee Gyu-bo. Nobody was interested. He tried to publish his translation from Korean of the Life of the Buddha, the Palsamno. Nobody was interested. It hasn't improved that much today, in fact. But then now, I think that it's consigned him to even more oblivion because he's also now been forgotten. Inside Korea, we saw that he still was appreciated in the 1920s and 1930s in Korea. So I think also he's very significant because what he and his pundits did was a third leg. So you had Choi Nam-sun and the Korean cultural nationalists doing their thing through the Chosun Kwanmun Way. You had the Japanese imperial Orientalists publishing books, translating them into Japanese, and using them to paint a very negative picture of Koreans, as lazy, as conniving, as factionalized, and all these things, while the Korean cultural nationalists were finding other images from those classics. And then you had Gale doing yet another third sort of project, which was much more aligned with what the Koreans were doing. So it relates to the politics of knowledge production. So his scholarship served no colonial power. It was not, in that sense, colonial. or imperialist. It concerned a country of no strategic importance to any Western power at the time, and thus was of no great interest to a Western reader or publisher at the time he was producing. So, nonetheless, what he did and what he was doing at the time confirmed and validated for his contemporary Korean intellectuals these simultaneous Korean and Japanese constructions of what was a Korean classic, what are our classic books. And so I think once I put this all together, and by the way, in your kind introduction, this book is not written yet. This is it. This is the problem. I have to write it now. There he is at the end of his retirement, and that takes me to about 5 minutes ahead of time. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer.
So I missed your introduction. What does hanmun actually mean and refer to?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Hanmun, broadly speaking, is anything written using sinographs, which is the term I prefer to use to translate the word hanja, which is usually translated as Chinese characters. But nowadays, I think we need to take the Chinese out of Chinese characters because China is trying to basically claim that they own all this stuff, and they don't. So sinograph gets us 1/2 step, at least, away from the word Chinese. But basically, anything from before 1910 that was written in classical Chinese, or what the Koreans now call hanmun. They didn't used to call it hanmun. Hanmun is a Japanese word. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the point being that he really wasn't very interested in anything written in Korean. Vernacular for him was just beneath his dignity, just as it was beneath the dignity of a Chosen scholar. So, yeah.
Actually, where did he learn his Chinese?
Well, he didn't learn Chinese.
Oh.
He learned hanmun. This is the point. And this is, even today, my colleagues at UBC who teach Chinese can't get it through their thick skulls that you don't need to speak Mandarin to learn hanmun. The Koreans learned it for 2,000 years without speaking a word of Chinese. And so he learned it from Ichanjik and from these other Christian Koreans that were trained in the old way in Korea, by memorizing all these texts.
Okay.
I was going to ask something. I forgot what I was going to ask. Gale was president of the RAS almost exactly 100 years ago.
That's right.
I think 1916, 17. So, and I have stayed with his granddaughters in England, so we're family. And actually, you see, when he died in Bath, and he's buried up on the hill above Bath, when he was buried, the stone they put over his grave had on it an inscription in Hangul.
Hangul, interesting.
That's what they say. But then the years passed and the family didn't pay attention, and suddenly somebody said, that stone is illegible. So they redid it, but nobody seems to know what that inscription said. You haven't found it?
No, that's the first I've heard of that. I don't know. Very interesting.
There's a gap.
But that's odd because knowing Gale, he would have preferred much. I mean, you saw he loves the Hunmin Jeongeum, and he as an evangelist or as a missionary, he saw the value of the vernacular. Of course, it's not that he didn't like anything. It's just in terms of literature, he thought that the modern literature was useless. Or wasn't good. But I would have thought he put it in hanmun.
No, but his Bible translation is a mixture.
Right.
It's a mixture of
Right.
Hangul with. Yes. I really can't remember what
It'll come back to you.
Anyway, he's my favorite guy.
I'm intrigued by its relationship to Maurice Quran and his bibliography. Of course, that too is an enormous job, actually. And your talk actually made me think, how did Quran manage to do all this?
Right.
Did he have similar assistants and so on and so on? But anyway, to which extent did Gale make use of Courant's work?
I think he was heavily influenced by and heavily indebted to Courant, and he says as much in numerous places. And even the way that he structured his catalog of Korean literature, I think basically follows the kind of format that Courant used. And even there also is in his notes, in his papers, the draft translation, although he didn't do it, but he might have had a hand in proofreading it, the translation into English of the introduction to Courant's Bibliophile Korean, which was published in the RAS. So all of the missionaries knew it and appreciated it. And of course, Gale was the only missionary who knew French, which is how he got roped into the dictionary project in the first place, because the first thing they did to start a big dictionary was to take everything out of the French missionary, the French Catholic dictionary. And he had studied French at university, and he had actually, I think, studied abroad in Paris for a semester. So yeah, he appreciated Courant. I don't think he knew him personally. I'm not aware that they had any personal contact. There's no correspondence. But his papers are also completely, there are almost no photos and there's almost no correspondence. And I actually believe that his papers were sanitized, or that he left behind, he or his wife, left the papers in a particular condition and pulled out certain things, that what we have is what he wanted the world to see. There's very little personal stuff in it, except for the odd draft letter.
In the Library of Congress, there's also that extraordinary sort of parallel history of the world, where the sort of year by year, almost day by day, right across the world history. And that's it. How did he do all that?
There's actually in Toronto something even more amazing, which is it's the actual publication from 1907, I can't remember the title of the book, but it's a hanmun book, which is, it's a chronological history of Korea, where he has gone in and translated, and his draft translation of this chronology of Korea is in Toronto with the original book, as well as other drafts of these world chronologies. And I think I'm sort of, a paper is brewing about this idea, because I don't know if you're familiar, but there's a famous anthropologist called, now it's kind of out of my head. But anyway, it'll come to me in a minute. It's German. You'll remember. Huh?
French boys?
No. He's alive now. His point is that what he calls the denial of co-evality is this term. This idea that Westerners and Orientalists deny to the people they study, whether it's natives in the field in Papua New Guinea or Koreans in colonial Korea, deny the observed the dignity of living in the same time and place that we live in. And so this idea of manipulation of chronology. We live here, but you live in the past. And Gale, through all of his papers, seems to want to openly challenge this. That at the time, and even takes it one step further, that basically when Choi Chi-won back in Shinla was writing beautiful prose in Korean, what were the people in Anglo-Saxon England doing? They were ignoramuses. And sort of his whole point was that Korea was a civilized country, it was a country of books, and it was a country of scholars. Unlike Japan, which was a country, a country of the sword versus country of the pen. And so for him, Korea was not only co-evil, and it was actually way ahead of Western Europe.
In the magazine, at one point he says, Korean culture has died. And it died on the day they abolished the kwago.
Yes.
Was that a common idea at that point?
Well, I don't know if it was common. I think most people said good riddance at the time. I mean, he was a minority position, certainly within the missionary community, but he was also a minority position amongst Koreans. They were ditching all of this. And the other metaphor he uses is that Korea, as soon as they abolished the civil service examination, it was like it had, the line, its anchor had been cut, and it was now this boat adrift at sea.
Okay, no more questions, so let's give him a big round of applause.